So it is a great pleasure for me to introduce to you this afternoon Dennis Scholl. Dennis is going to be in turn introducing our two sort of our two end of sessions speakers both today and tomorrow. So we've asked Dennis to introduce Trevor Paglen, and we've asked him tomorrow to introduce Rem Koolhaas, and there's a reason for that, and that's because Dennis is an art figure extraordinaire. He's also a gifted winemaker, making one of the most wonderful Shiraz wines from the Barossa Valley in South Australia. I've actually shared a bottle with him, and I can attest to its fine qualities. Some of you know I used to write wine labels for a living, so it's, listen, as a young writer, you'll do anything to stay afloat. So Dennis and Deborah Scholl reside in Miami, where they have been important players in that community. If you have ever seen the Art Deco buildings in Miami Beach, you've seen them on TV, or you've seen them in person, they played no small part in rescuing that architectural heritage of that city. They are internationally known art collectors, and they have played major roles in collecting European art in this country and also Aboriginal art, amassing probably the largest single private collection of Australian Aboriginal art in this country. Dennis has created a number of initiatives, some of which while he was at the Knight Foundation. If you ever saw those YouTube videos of the kids, like you'd be in a shopping mall and some little girl next to you would start singing a Christmas carol, and then some adult over here would pick up the tune, and then there'd be a cello that would join in, and pretty soon you had an entire orchestra and a chorus singing. That was a random act of culture, and that was Dennis's program. So he's innovative. He really cares about the life of communities and how culture plays an enormously important part in that. He has been connected with on the boards of serving on committees for the Guggenheim, the Tate, and the Perez. He's been on the board of the Perez Art Museum in Miami. And those roles he's played have resulted in hundreds of important art acquisitions. So he's been a major player in that part of our culture. He's also a 10-time regional Emmy winner for the film documentaries he makes. He's made works about Tracy Emin, Theaster Gates, Wynton Marsalis, and he's now in production on a film about Clifford Still. So Dennis is a larger-than-life figure, as you will soon find out, who walks in many arenas and does so with pride but yet humility, a joyousness in our humanity. And we're so pleased that he's a great friend of the museum. So please, won't you help me bring up Dennis Scholl.
Wow, you can't see anything up here. I feel like I'm in prison or something. Damn. Sarah said I could take 2 minutes of personal privilege. She's the one with the signs up here that gets the cane to pull you off if you run over. So I did want to talk for 2 minutes about this place, David Walker, and this team. I kept hearing the word insane today. Joanne kept saying, this is insane, that's insane. This place is insane. I just want to tell you that. Who else is going to raise millions of dollars and let Ugo build magic mountains in the desert? What other museum is going to convince us, including me, that the Greater West includes Australia? And then do 5 Aboriginal shows to back it up. And who else is going to find a way to let Trevor launch a freaking art satellite into orbit? So I got to say that being out here in Reno, this museum has somehow managed to avoid that internal, self-referential, artistic feedback loop that seems to be going on in a lot of major U.S. museums. So if that's insane, we're all the better for it. So please join me in thanking these guys. Now to our speaker. So what do you say about somebody that's really done it all? He's a geographer, he's an author, he contributed as a cinematographer in the Oscar-winning documentary Citizen 4, but most of all, he's an artist. And what kind of artist is he? Well, the New Yorker said it best when they said, Trevor Paglen simply makes art out of government secrets. And when I think about his work, and I think about it a lot, and I'll tell you a couple quick stories, I feel like he's telling me things about my government that I might not want to know, but that I need to know. I'm kind of obsessed with his artistic practice. Trevor has even ruined my morning jogs along the ocean in my home of Miami Beach. I used to think about the sunrise and the beautiful surf. Now all I think about are damn NSA underwater fiber optic cables. Where are they? Is it here? It's killing me. Then he almost got me in a lot of trouble last year. I was flying back from a remote Aboriginal community. Bill was talking about the fact that he and I have traveled over there and, spent a lot of time in the bush. But I'm flying back to a place called Alice Springs. It's kind of like the center of the continent. It's kind of like the Kansas of Australia. And I look to the south and I see the CIA listening station, Pine Gap. That's the place where they intercept and listen to all your phone calls. It's kind of a top secret place. So I asked the pilot, who I'm paying, to fly a little closer so I could get some photos. He looks at me like I'm nuts. He says, "We aren't allowed to get anywhere near there, mate." So I get him to nudge the plane a little closer, and all the time I'm thinking, Trevor Paglen would find a way to get closer. I take some okay photos, and I start popping them up on Instagram, and my Instagram blows up. My friends are writing saying, "Wow, dude, that takes a lot of guts." And I'm thinking to myself, I wonder what they're talking about. Finally, somebody calls me up and explained how much trouble you can get in for posting these kind of photos. I, of course, took them down immediately, but then I thought, damn, Trevor Paglen almost thought I was cool. So we have known for a long time that he is a special artist, but I have to say that that was confirmed last week when he won the MacArthur Genius Award. So please join me in welcoming my friend, Trevor Paglen.
Wow, what a beautiful introduction. I didn't know that Pine Gap story. That's cool. I do think you're cool. I've thought you're cool for a long time, though. We've known each other for a long time. Thank you. Thank you to the museum for inviting me. Thank you all for being here, although I can't see a single one of you. And and thank you to the museum for doing this project. It's overwhelming, actually. So I'm here to talk about the Orbital Reflector project, which you've heard a lot about over the last couple of days, and we'll just kind of go into it in a little bit more detail, maybe. So what is it? Well, good question. The very simple answer to that is it's a satellite. It's about that big. It weighs about a couple of kilograms, maybe 2 or 3 kilograms. Very lightweight. And inside is a giant inflatable structure. It's about 100 feet long and about 5 feet tall. And what we're going to do is take our little satellite, our little cube thing that's about the size of a brick, and it's going to go up on a rocket, and then the rocket's going to go up into space and deploy this little ring, and then our little satellite is going to get shot out of that ring and open up, and it's going to inflate to become this giant diamond-shaped structure. And then what's going to happen is that the sunlight will hit it, and it's designed to be very, very reflective, so that when the sunlight hits it, reflects that sunlight down to Earth, and you'd be able to see it as a slowly moving star, about as bright as one of the stars in the Big Dipper, moving through the sky. And that's the project. The end. Okay. That's all there is to it. We'll have like a application on your phone and a website, and people all over the world will be able to see it. So you can say, I'm in Reno, I want to see this thing. And you go to a website and it says, okay, we'll go out and at 10 o'clock at night and look in this part of the sky, and these are the stars that are there, and then this is the extra star that you're going to see, and that's what the project is. So you'll be able to see it really from all over the world, kind of slowly moving across the sky. Now, where does this stuff come from? Where do these ideas come from? They come from a lot of different places, but one of the first example that I know of an artist proposing and the idea of building art in space or doing art in space is actually Kazimir Malevich, the Russian avant-garde artist from the early 20th century. And basically, in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution, Malevich started filling up his notebooks with drawings of artworks and architectural structures that would be in orbit around the Earth. And this was the kind of ultimate goal of his suprematist art. And the ultimate goal of that suprematist art was to try to transcend human limitations, both in terms of representation, but also in terms of the terrain on which art takes place, hence his kind of interest in space. Now, what did he call these artworks that he imagined going around in space? He called them Sputniks. All right? Yeah, true story. Now, it's really interesting to see where Malevich himself was taking inspiration from. He wasn't the only Russian avant-gardist thinking about space. They were mostly all obsessed with space. And it wasn't just artists, it was writers and thinkers and scientists. There's a whole they were all inspired by a few thinkers from the 19th century and early 20th century that have kind of retroactively become known as like the Russian cosmists, right? So in American, space stuff, the astronauts are the people that go into space. In Russian, they're cosmonauts that go into space, right? And the grandfather of this kind of cosmist tradition is a guy named Nikolai Fyodorov, who lived in the late 19th century. He was a librarian at the Moscow Library, so he was very influential. And people, if you wanted to go learn something, you had to talk to Fyodorov. So he had lots of relationships with writers and thinkers at that time. Now, Fyodorov developed a philosophy that he called the philosophy of the common task. And what he argued in this philosophical text was that we as humans should organize all of our productive capacities in the service of a higher goal. And what that higher goal should be is, one, we should make ourselves immortal. Yep. Two, we should resurrect every human who's ever lived. Right? We should bring the dead back to life. And spaceflight was really important to this project for a couple reasons. One, we had to go to space so that we could collect the particles of our ancestors that had evaporated from the Earth, so we can bring them back and reconstitute them and resurrect them. And then once we've resurrected every human who's ever lived, they'll need a place to live. So we'll have to be able to have other planets that we can live on so that all the humans who've ever lived can live immortally, for the rest of time or what have you. Now, this was a very influential philosophy. I mean, there is a kind of weird, kind of mystical, transcendental communism or something like that inherent in some of these ideas. But you see the echoes of that if you read Russian science fiction or things like that. If you think about a film like Solaris, they go into outer space and they meet the aliens, but the aliens are like a reflection of their own ancestries and their own psychology. So you get these very weird kind of things in Russian space mythology that are very different than the kind of things that go on in American space mythology. But kind of fast forward to avant-garde artists like Malevich, who were very influenced by this philosophy. And this is the kind of the archetypal Malevich painting, the black square, right? Often in the kind of Western tradition, this is articulated as an early example of abstraction or what have you. But I'm not sure that that's how those guys were thinking about it. I think the black square is a photorealistic image of this process of becoming the cosmos, a photorealistic image of what the transcendence of life as we know it might look like. Now, to bring it back to Earth a little bit, and Dennis mentioned this a little bit, the other part of, another chunk of thinking about this project has to do with thinking about infrastructures on Earth. What are the kind of things, what are the ways in which we've transformed the planet? What are the kinds of things that we build to facilitate communication, to facilitate seeing, to kind of create the society as we know it. And I think about geographies, which is a part of this, as existing on horizontal axes, obviously, but also existing on vertical axes. And we don't think about those vertical axes very much. And what I mean by that, so for example, in the past, I've done projects where, as Dennis alluded to, is like trying to find all the undersea cables that constitute the internet and kind of flying around the world and trying to find places on the ocean floor where I can go scuba diving and find the internet, which is, the internet is underwater. The cloud is in the ocean, it turns out. It's under the sea. And this is kind of what it looks like. You see all these cables, like that's like the information superhighway is what you were. So we were looking at the depths of the oceans, and those cables in the depths of the oceans kind of interface with the land in places like this. And places like this is an NSA spy station in West Virginia, are the interface between terrestrial infrastructures and the infrastructures that exist in the heavens, that exist above our heads, that exist in space. This is another one of those. This is a communication link for reconnaissance satellites in New Mexico. And I've been doing for many, many years a project that I call the Other Night Sky. And it's a project where what I do is I try to track all of the secret satellites that are in orbit around the Earth. And there's hundreds of them, and they're adding new ones all the time. And you can kind of do this because you can build all the secret satellites that you want, like if you're the Air Force or the NSA or the National Reconnaissance Office, but you don't get to have your own secret laws of planetary motion, right? And so you can really use some pretty rudimentary mathematics, which I can't do, to try to find these things. And basically, there's a group of amateur astronomers around the world who go out every night with binoculars and telescopes and look at the skies. And when they see something moving, they just write down what they saw. And then what you can do is you take that observation and you look it up in publicly available catalogs of things that are in space, right? So the UN has registration documents. If you put something in space, you're supposed to register it with the UN. The Air Force has a similar ability to do this. And you can look it up in the publicly available databases. And if you don't see it, then you know you've seen something secret, right? So over many dozens of years, this kind of informal group of amateur astronomers have built up a kind of catalog of things that they see in the sky that aren't there, right? And because satellites have to follow Kepler's laws of planetary motion, if you get a good observation or two, you can model an orbit of that secret thing. And if you can model an orbit, you can start making predictions about where something will be in the sky. This is what a typical email looks like on that listserv. And so this is some of the modeling software. And I've been going out and trying to very precisely make predictions about where things will be in the sky. And when you do everything right, which is very rare, you get images like this, which basically you see that horizontal line. That is it's a spy satellite bisecting the film over the course of a long exposure. Now, when I look at things, I get interested. I try to find out something about the culture of infrastructures, the people that work on these things. I got really interested in this secret satellite thing called an X-37B, which is it's made by this outfit called the Rapid Capabilities Office. And this is a photo that the Air Force published of that. The X-37B is like a secret space shuttle drone. So it's like a small space shuttle that's unmanned, that does secret missions. It's currently on its 4th mission, and it can stay in orbit for years at a time. So I was tracking that, and this is a photograph of that. I think this is actually one of the Kickstarter rewards for the Orbital Reflector project. And so this is the X-37B. I finally got my hands on the crew patch for that. This is what they were wearing when they fly this thing. And it turned out the Rapid Capabilities Office. You see this Latin at the bottom there. They have this black world in the background, like badum-psh, and the bottom reads, doing God's work with other people's money. This is a spy satellite I photographed that does something called synthetic radar, synthetic aperture radar imaging. So it's a satellite that's a spy satellite, that's a secret satellite that can see through clouds and kind of can see at night and kind of do a lot of things that you can't do optically, and it does radar to do this. This is the patch for that guy. The octopus has a long history as as a figure in these kinds of images, and the octopus is never the good guy in the images. This is a satellite that, I love talking about these because I'm telling you these crazy stories about like these weird little lines, like in these kind of very abstract and nondescript images at all. This is an image that was shot from actually the Bay Area. So what you're seeing is that orange is like streetlights bouncing off of the low clouds as the fog's coming in. And that streak there is, we all know about the Hubble Space Telescope, right? Hubble Space Telescope, looking at the cosmos and who we are and where we came from, all that kind of good stuff. There's many more Hubble Space Telescopes. They're all pointed down at Earth, and they're secret. And that's one of those guys. So thinking about these kinds of landscapes, like thinking about infrastructures as existing, going from the depths of the ocean to the horizontal infrastructures of the land to the infrastructures that are above our heads all of the time, kind of invisibly but very presently, is another piece of the kind of inspiration behind the Orbital Reflector project. So now, when we're doing a project like this, we're thinking about spaceflight. And spaceflight is a very romantic thing. I mean, I almost think so much of us think about space as like magic or something like that. Space is just all these beautiful heavenly things, and we really, have some very strange ideas about spaceflight. And I'm kind of ambivalent about spaceflight for reasons that I will kind of talk about presently. So Malevich imagined spaceflight as being kind of developing spaceflight would be part of a project of overcoming alienation. That was the ultimate goal of the Cosmos project, was to make everybody immortal, resurrect the dead. In the process of doing that, the idea was that you would become one with the cosmos, right? That was the ultimate goal of that. And that, this is very much along the lines of like what Malevich was thinking about, like trying to develop this transcendental relationship to our environments and to the cosmos. And these little Sputniks, as he called them, were a step kind of on that path. Now, when Sputnik actually went into orbit, though, in 1957, it did not get there as a result of a kind of planetary effort to raise the dead and make ourselves immortal. In fact, the exact opposite is how it got there. Sputnik went to space on an R-7 intercontinental ballistic missile that was developed not to make little Sputniks in space, but was developed to deliver nuclear weapons across the globe. This was a weapon of mass destruction, the likes of which the world had never seen before. And there was no illusions about this at the time. Sputnik was very much a demonstration of the ability to wage intercontinental nuclear war. It was a demonstration of the ability to destroy cities, to destroy continents, and perhaps even to destroy the planet itself. So let's not mince our words here. That these, like spaceflight was built, as in its history is, as nuclear weapons delivery systems. Ways to kill as many people as quickly as you possibly could. And historically, that is what's funded spaceflight. That's where the research comes from. And that's the primary customer of spaceflight, is the world's war machines. Now, and furthermore than that, I really doubt that humans would have ever developed spaceflight at all if we had not developed nuclear weapons and if we had not had a Manhattan Project and there had not been a subsequent Cold War. There never has been and never will be a civilian space program. Space is something that is so fantastically expensive and so comparatively useless to do for anything other than mass destruction that it's hard for me to imagine it ever happening outside the context of a nuclear arms race. So from there we go to back to Orbital Reflector. So why are we doing this project? Well, let's talk about some of the technical aspects of it. There's a lot of technical problems that had to be solved over the course of doing this, as you can imagine. The satellite, as we said before, is this giant inflatable structure. It's about 100 feet long and about 6 feet tall. It is going to go into a kind of orbit that's called a circular orbit. In other words, the altitude of the orbit is really consistent across the whole thing. That orbit's about 575 kilometers. And this 575-kilometer orbit is a really good compromise, I think, of two things that are at odds with each other that we've had to navigate to over the course of the project, which is that we need to think about how bright is the satellite going to be to an observer on the ground. So that's one thing we need to think about. And the other thing that we need to think about is how long will the spacecraft stay in space, right? And these two things are at odds with each other. The lower the orbit you are in, the brighter the satellite will be to an observer on the ground, but the faster that it will kind of get burned up, the shorter amount of time it will stay in space. And conversely, the higher that you go up, the dimmer you are, but the longer that you stay in space. So kind of deciding on this orbit is a kind of compromise between those two things. We find that in this orbit, we should be in space for at least 2 months, and we should be as bright as one of the stars in the Big Dipper. And over the course of the lifetime of the object, it will actually get brighter. Yeah. Now, the inflation mechanism is something that I think is pretty cool how it works. Like, you can actually inflate this giant structure with just like a little Whippet cartridge, right? And it's cool why you can do that. Like, when you think about like inflating a balloon, right? You inflate a balloon, and I think your common sense understanding would be that the more air that you have a certain amount of volume of air that you put in, and that's what makes the balloon inflate. That's actually not what happens. That's not why a balloon inflates. A balloon inflates because the air pressure on the inside of the balloon is greater than the air pressure on the outside of the balloon, right? So guess how much air pressure we have in space? 0. So we can literally just use like a little Whippet and put some CO2 molecules in there and inflate this giant structure because the air pressure on the inside of the structure is going to be greater than the air pressure on the outside. So I think that's a pretty cool idea. Now, one of the other big things that we've had to think about a lot is reliability. This is an insane project, right? And this is a very risky project, so we have to think a lot about what are all the ways in which we can manage the riskiness of this project. So there's some places that you can manage it somewhat straightforwardly. If the rocket blows up, you can insure for that. What's really hard to insure for is if your satellite goes up fine on the rocket, it gets deployed, and now it's in outer space, and it disappears, and it just doesn't work, right? That's the real thing. That's the real scary danger zone in terms of developing reliability. So we have a couple solutions to that. One is we're actually building 2 satellites from the get-go, and that's to try to get some insurance in case the rocket blows up. If the rocket blows up, we're insured, so they have to give us another rocket, but we have to have another spacecraft to put on it. So we're building 2 right from the get-go. Building the 2 also is a way of hedging against the operability problem, like the problem of the satellite actually failing as well, because it turned out that if we wanted to ensure the functionality of our own satellite, to ensure that would actually cost more money than would actually be to just build a second satellite from the get-go. So that's one thing. The other way that we try to find reliability here is we have actually 2 independent subsystems within the spacecraft. There's essentially 2 independent satellites inside of it. There's one, when it goes into space, the primary system is on a timer. So basically it gets shot out and then it starts timing itself and waits like 8 hours, and then after 8 hours it sends a signal, okay, I'm gonna turn myself on, inflate the balloon, go for it. Now, if that system fails, we have a second backup system that can be manually triggered via ham radio that has an independent receiver, independent, Whippet, independent like burner for the doors and everything like that. And we can hit that with a ham radio signal and tell that second system to come online, and it should then do the as well. So those are the main ways that we've tried to manage the risk of the project. Because it's a space program, we have to have patches, right? And this is these are going to be they might be available already. I'm not sure if you looked at the I have a lot of fun designing these on conference calls, which are pretty epic conference calls go into this project, as you can imagine. So when we're looking at the longevity of the orbit, one of the other things that is a kind of unknown and cannot be known is like, what is the actual lifetime of the object? How long will it actually stay in space? That actually turns out to be a really, really hard question, and it's basically an impossible question. And the reason for that is that we have a very high volume object with very, very low mass, right? So we have like a gigantic structure that you can literally walk up to it, and if you blew on it, it would move all over the place. So what this means is that the object is highly affected by the weather on the sun, right? Because what happens is when you think about space, like we tend to think about like, here's the Earth and here's the atmosphere, and then there's space. Well, that's not actually how it works. When you go up into space, basically what's happening is basically the atmosphere is just getting thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner. But even if you go up, 1,000 kilometers above Earth, there's still little tiny wispy traces of the Earth's atmosphere that's up there. And because we have an object like this, which has so much volume but so little mass, little tiny molecules of the atmosphere that hit it contribute to drag, right? And that drag adds up over the lifetime of the object, and will eventually bring it down back down to Earth. Now, the reason I said like this is highly affected by the weather on the sun is because the sun has weather, and it sends out particles to the Earth, and what happens is that the weather from the sun affects the weather of the upper atmosphere of the Earth, right? So it kicks up molecules from the upper atmosphere into space. And that weather on the sun is fundamentally, unpredictable what it's going to do. So the best that you can do is you kind of make a bell kind of shape that's based around the estimates of the lifetime of your spacecraft, but it's to a certain degree dependent on the weather on the sun. So, when we announced the project, inevitably there were some critiques, and I think that's fine. That's good. So one of the critiques was that are you guys just like making more space junk, right? Fair question. It turns out actually that in fact quite the opposite. It turns out that an inflatable structure like this is a way to mitigate against space junk, because basically what you're demonstrating is that you can add something to an existing satellite that has a huge drag profile and helps bring it back down to Earth, right? So you could take something like this and add it to another satellite, and if you want to do an end-of-life maneuver for another satellite, you don't want to have space junk, one of the ideas you could do is inflate a giant balloon, and that's going to add a bunch of extra drag to that structure and bring it down to Earth faster. Or not down to Earth, but bring it down to the atmosphere where it will burn up. So there paradoxically is a kind of debris mitigation demonstration that's going on with this thing. Now, another kind of critique would be like, aren't you just gunking up the night sky with a bunch of man-made crap? And I hate to say it, but that train has left the station. Like that, there's, the sky is already filled with man-made crap. The NORAD tracks about 20,000 man-made objects in orbit around the Earth. Most of them are bits of debris, the result of collisions and the result of anti-satellite experiments, and the result of military experiments. So in some ways, that has already left the station, and I think that in a way, we're also trying to do the opposite there, which is to ask people to look at the sky and to think about what our relationship to the sky is, and maybe raise some consciousness about what that is. And so for me, the bet is that it's worth it in that sense. So we kind of arrive at, for me, is what the kind of final point of the project is in a way, and the project is called Orbital Reflector, and there's something it's called that because I wanted to have the driest title possible. I thought this is such a romantic gesture that we try to chop that off at the legs, in terms of how we title the thing, So that's where the name comes from. But but for me, it kind of has a double meaning in the sense that it is reflecting the sun, but it's also reflecting the ground as well, right? So it's like quite literally putting a mirror in the sky. And I think that's an opportunity to think about a lot of things. And I think one of the things that you can think about is what is, it is really about this ambivalence that I have in relationship to space flight. And I'm so ambivalent about spaceflight that I'm almost in the category of like, let's not do it. And the reason for that is that, as I said before, I think that spaceflight, as it actually exists, sort of can only be nuclear war by proxy in one sense. But I think that there is another aspect to that, which is that one of the big problems I have with spaceflight is that in the American imagination anyway, spaceflight is totally bound up with like the idea of progress. It's completely bound up with the idea of the frontier. We don't think about going to space as a way to collect the particles of our ancestors that we can kind of reconstitute and kind of trade a kind of transcendental communism. In the American context, we think about going to the moon and planting a flag. Right? Thinking about going to an asteroid and like mining the asteroids, right? In other words, we in the American imagination, we recapitulate the frontier, right? We imagine like colonizing Mars. And in some ways, we think about space in the same ways that historically we've thought about Nevada, actually. It's a place where, what do you do in Nevada? You do some mining, you plant some flags, set up some colonies. And maybe we still do. Now, the other part of that is that the other problem that I have with that is that I think in the American imagination, the imagination of going to space and colonizing other places has been almost a means that we use to try to imagine that the planet we live on is disposable, and it's not. We like literally cannot live in other places, right? We are completely and exquisitely evolved to be on this planet right now. Why don't we live on the bottom of the ocean if we're going to live in space? Living on the bottom of the ocean is a hell of a lot easier than living on Mars. There's water down there, there's oxygen, there's life forms. We could live on Antarctica, and I guess you could sort of argue that we do live on Antarctica, but we really don't. And the point being is that the most extreme environments on Earth are far more hospitable to human life than other planets are. And so what is the imagination that we can leave this planet do to our sense of self? And I worry that it is a kind of suicidal imagination, actually. On the other hand, again, I'm totally, I have a very conflicted relationship to space. On the other hand, like humans have always looked to the stars and to the skies as mirrors of ourselves, as ways of trying to articulate our relationship to things like the planet, to try to articulate our relationship to time, as a way to try to learn about ourselves. And that's just as much true of the Babylonians who were looking at constellations and movements of planets and trying to divine the future and try to make sense of the cosmos that way, to the Greeks, imagining gods in the constellations, to the astrologers, trying to explain why people are who they are based on the movements of the planets. Fast forward to the Hubble Space Telescope, which is doing the same thing, you could argue, trying to see the limits of the universe, trying to answer these big questions about who are we, where have we come from, where are we going. All of these kinds of questions historically have been articulated in relation to the sky, in relation to the night sky in particular. And so for me, that's really what the project is about. It is this reflector in the night sky. And for me, I hope that it's an opportunity for thinking about some of these questions and to, and not only that, but just to go out and look and use your eyes and use your imagination, which is always happening at the same time, and be a kind of opportunity. Give people permission to imagine, their own relationships to some of these big questions. So thank you guys all so much for coming.
Yeah, all right, okay, all right. I won't be able to see me, but do a little Q&A.
Is there anything that you want to talk about, Bill? There's this whole frontier current.
Yeah,
to the
I've been
whole
having
project.
I've been having these troubles sleeping, and so when Trevor and I first talked about this project in New York City, he had been an artist in residence at MIT, and you were funded by, was it Creative Time? I think you were.
Yeah, Creative Time at MIT.
Yeah, and you had designed a disc.
Yeah, this is the second space project.
Talk
I've
about
done,
the
yeah.
last pictures. Would
Yeah,
you?
so
Okay.
a lot of the possibility of doing this project opened up from doing a project I did that launched in 2012, which is a project called The Last Pictures. And that project came out of doing the spy satellites and learning about orbital mechanics. One of the things that I learned was that certain kinds of satellites, communication satellites in particular, are really, really far away from Earth. They're about 36,000 kilometers away. And they're so far away from Earth that they are decidedly outside of the atmosphere. All this business with drag and stuff like that doesn't apply to them. And so what happens when those satellites power down is nothing. They just stay there. And when you kind of do the orbital analysis of when they come back to Earth, the answer is infinity. Right? And so I started thinking about, like, every satellite that's ever been put in that orbit is still there and will be there for, mathematically, infinite amount of time. And so I started thinking about the fact that this is very weird that, I actually called up a friend of mine who's a really good orbital analyst, and I said, I'm seeing these numbers, this is very weird stuff. And I said, is it true that these communication satellites stay in orbit around Earth forever? And he said, yeah. And I said, okay, well, that means that these are the longest lasting artifacts that humans have ever made, because there's no erosion in space, there's no volcanism, there's no, the kinds of things that wear down human infrastructures. And he said, yeah, I think about those as artifacts, right? And so I started thinking about the fact that, at some point in the Earth's history, we're going to be gone, or we'll have evolved into something that's completely unrecognizable from what we are now. And, the cities and most of our geologic, impacts on the planet will be entirely erased. But there will be a ring of, like, dead spaceships in orbit around the Earth that is now a permanent part of the planet. And I was sort of imagining that we're the ancient aliens who built these kind of dead robot spacecraft that just kind of circle around the Earth forever, which is true. And so I thought, well, we have to do something about that. And so I went to Creative Time in MIT, and I said, can we figure out how to make images that are really, really archival and can live in space? And the design requirement was that they had to be as archival as the sun. So the MIT guys are
3.5 billion years?
Yeah, like 4 billion years,
yeah.
I think. And the guy that I worked there with at MIT said, well, nobody knows what happens in 4 billion years, but this should be good for a couple of 100 million at least. So basically, it's a collection of images that all have to do with transformations that humans have made to the planet. So, like, environmental and atmospheric and things like that. So what images that sort of speak to the impact of human activities on the planet. It's a little bit more surrealistic than that, but generally that's sort of what it's about. And we worked with a company, EchoStar, who agreed to host it on one of their satellites. So we installed it on there and launched it in 2012. And the guy who was at EchoStar was a guy named Zia Aboudiat, who was in charge of building that whole satellite. And I thought this guy hated my guts when we worked on the project together, because he would, give me stuff like, okay, he would send me literally documents the size of telephone books, and he's like, okay, here's all the technical requirements I need you to fulfill, and I need it done in 2 weeks, and by the way, it's Christmas, good luck. So there was a kind of a learning curve there. But we ended up doing everything, and me and Zia turned out to be really good friends. It turned out he was an artist and a poet and actually really loved the project. He was sort of kind of kicking me around a little bit to make sure that, for reliability reasons, basically, he wanted to trust me. And so we became friends, and then he retired, and then we had already started working on Orbital Reflector, and I was having drinks with him. I said, hey, well, you're not just going to play golf, man. Why don't you build this Orbital Reflector satellite as a retirement project? And he agreed to do it. So we have kind of like the best project manager money could buy, on the Orbital Reflector project.
So this is not, this disc is not like the Carl Sagan Voyager golden disc, Go ahead. There's a very interesting dialogue between those objects. Yeah.
Yeah, in some ways it's the anti-golden disk, but it also, working on that project, I developed a lot of sympathy for that golden disk, which I think is a very easy project to dismiss for very good reasons. But you have to, but you're thinking through a lot of the same kinds of questions, right? But I guess starting from maybe a more jaded place than they started with the Golden Record project, but arriving at some surprisingly arriving at some places that were much more convergent than I imagined them. And that was really, in particular, there was a dialogue that I was having between two mathematicians, a guy at UC San Diego named Rafael Nunez, and a guy in the Midwest named Joel Weisberg. And the big philosophical question with that project was, to what extent are you taking this gesture seriously? To what extent, obviously the audience for the project is people here now. But to what extent do you take the audience in the future seriously? And that is a kind of impossible question. But ultimately, I kind of decided that that's an ethical question. That if there is the possibility, however vanishingly remote that might be, that somebody would find this in the future, do you have a responsibility for having the possibility of that person being able to learn something from it? And I decided that we should make something that potentially somebody could learn something from, which is a very weird conclusion, but to arrive at, because it's not where I started. Anyway, that's a different project. But
So David Walker and Amanda Horn and I went to the New York Times to talk with them about the different projects we're involved in. And one of the things that makes this museum unique and makes the Center for Art and Environment unique is that we commission big projects in order to collect the archives. So we don't just go to someone who's done something and saying, hi, can we have your stuff? Or that person has passed away and we would like their stuff from the estate. We actually work with a living artist. And so if you go to the Ugo Rondinoni Gallery upstairs and Land Art Project, and you look in there, you will see legal documents. And the legal documents make a stack that's, pretty substantial. Your engineering documents, so it becomes this very, very interesting project for us. So we're not only just simply documenting an artistic impulse and then a project, we're actually documenting a process through which it is possible for art to reach into a place that is kind of utopian and lives in the imagination in a very unique way. New York Times, called the Last Pictures the longest running exhibition in the history of humankind. And they're referring to this project as, that's going to be the largest exhibition on the planet, actually off the planet, but yeah. So there's this, what you're doing is you're touching absolutes in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Orbital Reflector in some ways is the opposite of Last Pictures. I mean, for me, the Orbital Reflector is the mandala sand piece where you making this exquisitely complicated and intricate thing, and hopefully something that's quite beautiful that will literally just burn up in a pretty short time frame, right? But hopefully for a moment in time, there'll be this beautiful thing that will exist.
So I'm thinking about Michael Heiser's career, who's built the largest sculpture on the planet, City, which is 1 1/3 miles long and 1/3 of a mile wide, and it sits out in the Nevada desert, and he wants it to last for a very long time. His hero is Borglum, the guy who did Mount Rushmore.
Yeah.
And it's Michael's contention.
And did the Confederate
and did the Confederate, well, he started, and then it got erased by the next artist, and yeah, I know. And he was in bed with all those guys in a very nasty way. But it's all about monuments.
Yeah.
And it's all about the human need to bring someone around, or bring everyone around something, so you share something on a global scale. And to do that as an ephemeral gesture is very poignant. So I mean, you and I went over back and forth about the language and the nomenclature and Orbital Reflector. It still is going to be a romantic object in a certain way, a romantic undertaking.
Absolutely, it's absolutely. I mean, I think that's what we were trying to arrive at. I remember having a huge brainstorm with you about what is the most boring name that we can probably find like that. It has to be the most boring thing that we can possibly do. But yeah, it is. There is that deeply romantic gesture, and I guess in terms of trying to find the language around it is how I don't want it can't be a universalizing gesture though, right? How do you do something like this with humility? Is really, I mean, to me, that's the only way that you can ethically do a project like this, and that's something that we've had a lot of discussions about. Is how do we find language that's not about progress and and rockets launching and stuff like that? How do we have this be a minor gesture in a way.
Yeah, so I was giving a talk at the Long Now Bar in San Francisco, and Stuart Brand, who did the whole Earth catalog, is in the audience. He's not just in the audience, he's right there. And Stuart was the guy who convinced NASA to release a photograph of the Earth seen from orbit, a picture taken by an astronaut. We don't go far enough out into space anymore that we can take that picture. And so I was telling Stuart, you started this, it's your problem. You made us thirst for that look at ourselves. I mean, when he published that image on the Whole Earth catalog, that is one of the primary movers for the environmental movement. Because you're looking at that and you're going like, oh, it's all black all around, and the planet's not that big. So I'm hoping, my hope for this project is that it rekindles just a little bit of that awe and that little bit of that humility about not living in a disposable place. So yeah. Are there questions in the audience? Yeah, we've got a question right up here. Yeah. Wait for the microphone to get to you if we've got, we'll pass the mic down.
I have some from the Sky Room.
Okay, go ahead first, Amanda, while the
Okay,
mic's getting
so we
in.
have several from the Sky Room, but I know we're probably going to run short on time, so I'll ask a two-part question, which are sort of related. First of all, Trevor, can you speak about the choice of shape and the sort of touch on the sphere and then why the sphere became a diamond? And then the second question, which is a little bit more esoteric, is this project art, science, or philosophy, or all of the above? And what is the carbon footprint of putting art in space?
Great question. So the original models for the spacecraft were spheres. And that was kind of based on my naive understanding of how the mechanics would work, which a sphere is the most efficient shape to have, a large amount of volume have the most efficient surface area in relation to the volume of the object. And so I thought that would be the most, efficient shape in terms of reflecting sunlight, which is the whole point. But it turns out that wasn't right. Like that, what we care about is not overall surface area. We care about usable reflective surface area, which is a different question. And it turns out that diamond shape is much more efficient in that way. It's also much more efficient in a second way, which is related to this question of drag. The sphere shape has a very, much higher what they call ballistic coefficient. In other words, it's far more affected by these small amounts of, atmospheric particles hitting it, and the drag accumulates much faster in the spherical shape. And the diamond shape is simply more, literally more aerodynamic, and that buys us, extra lifetime on orbit, basically. The second part of the question was related. What was the second part of the question again? Art philosophy. Yeah. I guess, for me, I don't make a distinction between any of those things. I guess, for me, the point of doing art is really two things. One is doing things that help you learn how to see the world that you're living in, and things that help you get a tiny, humble glimpse of what the world might look like if we could reimagine what the rules are that structure the world, right? So I guess I kind of want both of those things out of it, and to me the Orbital Reflector project sort of solidly falls in that second category, in the sense that we're trying to design an object that has no military value, that has no commercial value, and has no scientific value, really. Can we just make an aesthetic object in this space that has historically been so militarized, and so much a part of, warfare apparatuses and what have you. The other part of that question was what's the carbon footprint of the project? The carbon footprint is actually negligible, in the sense that we're not actually buying a rocket. We're piggybacking on a rocket that's going up anyway. So it's sort of like we fly free, basically, on somebody else's carbon footprint.
So I think of your work as starting out as finding these violent geoglyphs and astroglyphs that are hidden from us, and now you're making an astroglyph. Does that mean that a geoglyph follows? And if not, why not?
That a geoglyph follows?
Yeah, like a land monument, temporal or otherwise. You're making a sky reflector.
Oh,
your work is
yeah.
discovering.
I don't know. I don't know.
Jerry, yeah.
Yeah, I have a quick question about the duration of the project and the sorts of potential human responses to it. And what triggered this question is your comments towards the end of your talk about the way in which traditional kind of archeo or ethnoastronomies look to the sky. But just a little bit I know about that topic, the assumption there is that those stellar appearances are going to be predictable and recurrent. And so what I'm wondering about is, does the inherent limited duration of your project give a certain specific, or does that in and of itself define the potential range of human responses to it that can be imagined?
No, it's a good question. I mean, I do think that it creates an event in a way that, maybe like the movements of, Mars or something like that over thousands of years doesn't create that kind of crystallizable event in the same way. But I think that is what we're trying to use to our advantage, actually, is to kind of like, by having that limited space. I mean, first of all, we don't want to have create just space junk that's there forever. So just kind of ethically, we need to really limit the lifetime of the project. But the second part of it is by having that relatively narrow window in which it's viewable, we can create a more effective excuse for people to go out and look at it, to look at the sky. So I think that we can kind of amplify that, actually, by having that narrower window.
So I'm wondering, obviously we're going to see this brighter star in the sky when this successfully deploys, but have you figured out a way to capture an image of it in space from anything?
We talked about this a lot, yeah. Okay, so and it's a really good question, and the answer to that is maybe a little bit counterintuitive. So we had some designs that had cameras on it where it would kind of take a picture of itself. That's actually pretty easy to do. What's really hard to do is how do you get that data down to Earth, right? And so what it turned out was the really hard problem with that is that you take the picture, but then you have to get the data down to Earth. So that means you have to send telemetry to a relay satellite. So you have to be able to send this digital data to a satellite that can relay it down to Earth, which means now you have to have like an attitude control system in your own satellite. So you have to be able to move your satellite autonomously in different directions and things like that. So that creates two problems. One is that the complexity of your system goes up a bunch, which means that it costs a bunch more money. And second of all, you're adding a whole bunch of new subsystems that something could go wrong in. And so we basically decided going with the ham radio option, the most reliable kind of tried and true, communication system that you can imagine.
One more question. Yep, up top. I can't see what someone's gesturing at me, and I don't know. Oh, I see. Okay, so, okay, all right.
And this one is from one of our educators in the Founders Room. Trevor, how will you be announcing the launch to the world? How can people get access to the satellite's location and learn more about the mechanics of the satellite?
That's
Why doesn't she answer that?
Yeah, that's your problem. Hashtag not my problem.
So Amanda, we're going to have a phone app, right? That's going to ping you
Yeah.
and to let you know where the satellite is in space. That's one thing.
Yeah, so we've partnered with a company that makes the kind of star viewing software, so that it'll be available in there. And then also on the website that we have for the project, there'll be a function where you can go and put in your location, and then it will model the orbit based on your location and give you viewing windows and draw charts for you that will help you find it in the sky.
So at the end of the first conference in 2008, within 2 weeks we had 1.2 million hits online about the conference. People were just fascinated by this around the world. Wow, that was huge. We put up Ugo Rondinone, we got 200 million hits in a couple of days because Beyonce stops by and tweets or does whatever those people do, right? Instagram, tweet, I don't know, whatever it was. And so now this project, what's the latest figure, Amanda, about the number of hits online? Almost.
Online news visits from the Kickstarter campaign run in 1 month.
and it isn't even launched yet, you know. So I think the world's going to know when this goes up. Yeah, exactly. So far, this project has generated 880 million hits online, almost 1 billion hits online. So I think the world's going to know when the satellite launches from Vandenberg. Trevor, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
and
And
of
thank
course,
you all so
yeah.
much for coming.